Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At a major conference on the future of Afghanistan, Afghan President Hamid Karzai said today Afghans want to take responsibility for their own security, but not for another 4 years.
I remain determined that our Afghan National Security Forces will be responsible for all military and law enforcement operations throughout our country by 2014. Our National Police and National Directorate of Security have also shown progress.
Karzai's comments came during a major conference on the future of Afghanistan attended by over 70 nations. The meeting's been described as the biggest international gathering in Kabul in 40 years. It was the 9th international conference on Afghanistan, but the first to actually be held in the country. Discussion at the forum focused on 3 main areas: security, development, and reconciliation talks with fighters opposed to the government. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton suggested U.S. troops will remain in Afghanistan for years to come.
July 2011 date captures both our sense of urgency and the strength of our resolve. The transition process is too important to push off indefinitely, but this date is the start of a new phase, not the end of our involvement. We have no intention of abandoning our long-term mission of achieving the kind of Afghanistan that President Karzai set forth in his speech.
Security was extremely tight for the Afghan conference, but earlier today, rockets landing at or near the main Kabul airport forced a plane carrying UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Sweden's Foreign Minister Carl Bildt to divert to U.S.-controlled Bagram Air Base. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen has admitted the U.S. and NATO underestimated the scale of the mission in Afghanistan. In a commentary in the German newspaper Der Spiegel, Rasmussen wrote, quote, "After 9 years of international involvement, it's become painfully clear that the price we have to pay is much higher than expected, especially regarding the international and Afghan soldiers killed. It cannot be disputed that the international community underestimated the size of this challenge in the beginning," he wrote. NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Senate Democrats are hoping to break a Republican filibuster today and approve extending unemployment benefits to millions of out-of-work Americans. If the Democrats secure enough votes, about 2.5 million people will receive jobless benefits retroactively instead of being dropped from the federal program. On Monday, President Obama demanded the Senate take action.
It's time to stop holding workers laid off in this recession hostage to Washington politics. It's time to do what's right. Not for the next election, but for the middle class. We've got to stop blocking emergency relief for Americans who are out of work. We've got to extend unemployment insurance. We need to pass those tax cuts for small businesses and the lending for small businesses.
The Obama administration has given BP the go-ahead to keep its ruptured oil well sealed for another day, despite worries about the well leaking some oil and methane gas. On Monday, White House spokesperson Robert Gibbs confirmed there have been some leaks.
There is seepage about 3 kilometers away from the wellhead. There are bubbles that are visible on the underwater camera, which we continue to monitor. And there are some leaks from the upper part of the wellhead in where the shear ram has closed. Those all bear special monitoring.
The BP oil spill is expected to top the agenda of today's meeting in Washington between President Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron. Cameron may also be questioned over BP's alleged involvement in the decision to free Lockerbie bomber Abdelbasset El-Megrahi from jail last year. The 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, killed 270 people. BP has been accused of lobbying for El-Megrahi's release in an attempt to protect its oil interests off the Libyan coast. In other news from the Gulf, Marathon Oil has become the first oil company to resume deep-water oil production in the Gulf of Mexico since the U.S. government halted drilling after the massive BP oil spill. Marathon Oil's new well is located about 160 miles southwest of New Orleans and is 3,000 feet deep. The well is expected to produce about 50,000 net barrels of oil per day at its peak. U.S. National Guard troops will arrive along the border with Mexico on August 1st as part of President Obama's plan to increase border security. The administration's pledged to send up to 1,200 National Guard troops to the area for a year. Almost half the National Guard force will go to Arizona. Alan Burson is the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection.
National Guard is there to support the efforts of law enforcement, not to have a direct law enforcement role, not to confront, unless confronted, any particular threat. So this is a question of supporting law enforcement. The National Guard has done that extremely well in the past, and we trust will do so again on this occasion.
In news from Mexico, the Washington Post reports grenades made in the United States and sent to Central America during the 80s and 90s are now being used by Mexican drug cartels. There have been more than 72 grenade attacks in Mexico in the last year, including assaults on police convoys and public officials. The majority of the grenades have been traced back to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, countries where the U.S. sent hundreds of thousands of hand grenades in the 80s and early 90s. One of the most common hand grenades found in Mexico is the U.S.-made M67. Between 1980 and 1993, the Reagan and Bush administration sent some 266,000 M67 grenades to El Salvador. In other news from Latin America, an Afro-Colombian activist named Jair Murillo was assassinated Saturday, a day before he was to take part in a march led by internally displaced groups in Colombia. The Washington Office on Latin America reports Murillo's organization was one of several Afro-Colombian groups that recently received death threats from a paramilitary organization called the Black Eagles. Authorities in Denver have launched an investigation into the death of homeless pastor Marvin Booker, who died in police custody 2 weeks ago. Witnesses have told the Denver Post Booker was forcibly restrained, tasered, then placed face down in a holding cell. He was pronounced dead hours later. A 25-year-old staff sergeant for the Maryland Air National Guard is facing up to 16 years in prison for uploading a video on YouTube that showed an undercover police officer pulling a gun on him during a traffic stop. Anthony Graber was initially ticketed for speeding, but once he posted the video, the state charged him with 4 felonies, including violating Maryland's wiretap law. State police officers also raided Graber's parents' home and confiscated his camera, computers, and external hard drives. Graber is one of many Americans facing possible jail time for videotaping police activity. Last week, Democratic Congressmember Adolphus Towns of New York introduced a non-binding resolution calling for the protection of citizens who videotape cops in public from getting arrested on state wiretapping charges. The Olympia Food Co-op in Washington state has voted to boycott Israeli goods. The co-op is believed to be the first U.S. grocery store to agree to such a boycott. One item exempted from the boycott is Peace Oil, a fair trade olive oil made by Palestinians and exported by Israelis. Olympia is the hometown of Rachel Corrie, the 23-year-old college student who was crushed to death by an Israeli army bulldozer in Gaza 7 years ago. Meanwhile, in news from Israel, an Israeli military court has ordered the early release of the Israeli soldier who shot and killed British peace activist Tom Herndl in 2003. Tassir Haib will be freed next month after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence. Herndl's sister said she's angry and shocked over the soldier's early release. And the prominent U.S. climatologist Stephen H. Schneider has died at the age of 65. Schneider taught at Stanford and was part of a United Nations panel of climate change that shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. He founded the journal Climatic Change. Stephen Schneider often talked about the urgency of addressing global warming.
And we started out saying sort of, Houston, there's a problem in 1990. Then we said, not only is there a problem, but the humans are part of it. In 1995 and 2000, Terry Rood added, and plants and animals are in it too. And now we said not only is there a problem, but it hurts the poor more than the rich. It hurts the vulnerable in Hurricane Alley and in high mountains and in the Arctic and in Mediterranean climates like California more than others. And that we've got to get on with solving this before we really end up with a lot of key vulnerabilities and serious, dangerous outcomes. We should have started 25 years ago, so let's get on with it.
And those are some of the